So this City Club program will look at the big picture of oppression and cultural norms that perpetuate dominant and submissive power dynamics. From bullying, gender and sexual orientation violence, to domestic abuse and sexual assault. These aggressions on other people's dignity and safety are happening in homes and schools in all neighborhoods, from all socioeconomic backgrounds, workplaces and professions of all kinds, and communities of faith, culture, and political persuasions. There is no one not touched by violence, unfortunately. Most, we hope, is that today's participants and people who might view this video in the future will learn how this power dynamic of dominant and submissive power is used and at the heart of the various abuses we see of humans to one another in our society. And we hope that you'll learn how to recognize it and deal appropriately with it when you encounter it at home or at work or in your community. We've invited 2 community speakers to explore this topic and this continuum of violence with us today, and I'd like to introduce them as they come up to the panel, so if you don't mind. We have joining us today Kristin Anderson and Susan Marks. Kristin Anderson is a sociology professor at Western Washington University, and she's going to address the big picture of oppression and ways everyday behaviors reinforce this use of dominant and submissive power and impact other people's dignity and their safety and rights. Susan Marks is a director of the Bellingham-Whatcom County Commission Against Domestic Violence, and she'll address the everyday picture of how power, control, and intimidation tactics are used every day at work, in our schools, community activities, and homes, and many of them over time leading to habits and perpetuation of violence in ways that affect all types of families and individuals. You have some materials on your table that they brought today that they might refer to. We also will have some short presentations and a clip from Jackson Katz's film, Tough Guys 2. So we're going to start with that short clip, and following the brief introduction to Jackson Katz theory, we will be having short presentations by each of the speakers, and following that, we'll have questions that you can ask them. So again, we thank you for taking your lunch today to talk about a conversation that we don't have often enough, much less over a meal. So I thank you for joining us today to be brave and bold and honest about what's hurting others in our community and what each of us could be doing differently to help make it stop. If you are not familiar with Jackson Katz, he's a researcher on violence and gender tradition and forms. He looks at how violence is a behavior that's taught and why domestic violence is not an anger management issue. Rather, domestic violence is the management of another person through tactics of power, control, and violence. And that use of violence might span across a wide range of behaviors, many of which are actually taught as cultural norms to men in our society. So we'll watch a short clip from his film, and then we'll follow up with some more understanding about how this functions, both in our everyday society and also in family relations and life. And if you have questions, we hope that you will write them down as they're coming up during this presentations so that we can get to the heart of what's important for you to take home when you leave here today. So thank you.
Boys about what it means to be. Boys about what it means to be a man. We often talk about violence being a learned behavior, but it's more to the point to say that it's a taught behavior. And by shifting the focus from learned to taught, we shift the onus of responsibility onto those of us who are teaching our sons what it means to be a man. Since the 1970s, sociologists and other researchers have identified a consistent set of messages the culture sends boys about what it means to be a real man. William Pollock introduced the idea of a boy code in which boys are taught from a very early age to act tough and not show their feelings. Michael Kimmel extended the reach of the boy code into late adolescence and young adulthood, where he describes a guy code in which young men police each other into conformity with dictates about manhood that come with an implicit and sometimes explicit warning. Don't slip up or you risk being unmasked and found out as someone who doesn't measure up. The result is that guys are put into a box that turns out to be the perfect breeding ground for violence. We can't show any emotion except anger. We can't think too much or seem too intellectual. We can't back down when someone disrespects us. We have to show we're tough enough to inflict physical pain and take it in turn. We're supposed to be sexually aggressive with women. And then we're taught that if we step out of this box, We risk being seen as soft, weak, feminine, or gay.
You're so ugly you could be a modern art masterpiece. What's your name, fat body?
Sir, Leonard Lawrence, sir.
Lawrence what, of Arabia?
Sir, no, sir.
I don't like the name Lawrence, only and sailors are called Lawrence. From now on, you're Gomer Pyle.
Sir, yes, sir.
Anything short of full-scale emotional shutdown becomes a source of humiliation and shame. And in response, young men learn to adopt what I call the tough guise, the front so many young men put up to shield their vulnerabilities and avoid being ridiculed. As sociologist C.J. Pascoe details in her harrowing book, Dude, You're a Fag, the day-to-day humiliation boys and young men are subject to on a daily basis in our schools borders on criminal. Their every move relentlessly and brutally scrutinized for anything with even a whiff of femininity or weakness by peers that take it upon themselves to serve as gender cops.
Are you calling stupid?
No, I said gym class was stupid.
No, I said gym class was... Listen to this little...
But it doesn't just come from their peer groups. It comes from fathers, coaches, and older male role models as well.
Hit me. Come on, hit me. Come on. Come on, Jack. Hit me. Hit me. Hit me. Come on. Come on. Here it is. Here it is. Hit it. Come on, son. Come on. Son, left. What are you doing?
So again, this is a difficult conversation, and it's one that we as grandparents or aunties or cousins might have any opportunity to take a smarter, wiser step back and ask, what could I be doing about some of this norming that might be happening? So we have some guest presenters today to tackle this concept and take it from what might seem a very exportable problem that lives somewhere else and start to think about some of the closer to home issues that are happening here in Whatcom County and some practical things that we could be doing to support the development of healthy responses to aggression and healthy responses to vulnerability. So I'd like to introduce Kristin Anderson, who's a professor of sociology at Western Washington University. She's going to share with us a presentation she uses to help people understand more about gender inequalities and intimate partner violence. We're going to have a video, or excuse me, some PowerPoints queued up there if you're wondering what he's running over here for. Her primary research agenda focuses on the interconnections between gender and these inequalities and has served on the editorial boards of the Journal of Marriage and Family and Gender and Society. She's a member of the board of directors for the Domestic Violence and Sexual Assault Services of Whatcom County, and her research has appeared in the Journal of Marriage and Family, Gender and Society, Sex Roles, Journal of Family Issues, and Violence Against Women. Her recent work focuses on verbal aggression against women and how the court system responds to victim survivors of domestic violence. So thank you for joining us and helping us better understand this big picture about oppression and dominant submissive behavior rules. And thank you for, if you'd like to watch, there's some things that she'll point out over here. If you'd like to look, you can watch her talk about them here, and we'll let you get yourself settled. Thank you.
So there are many, many ways that our culture sends messages that encourage us to tolerate oppression and violence. I'm going to focus on just 3 today in this short time, and I chose them because they represent different areas of our society. So first, our entertainment and our media industry, which gives us messages about what it means to be a man, what it means to be a woman. I'm particularly going to focus on what it means to be a woman and the social construction of femininity. Secondly, our political and our legal ideology, which sends us messages about where we can intervene and what we should consider private and leave alone. And lastly, our economic structure, which leads us to a world in which many people have plenty and others are left with scarcity. So, we just saw a clip in which Jackson Katz is talking about the messages that boys and men receive about what it means to be a man in this culture. And one very dominant message that we give men and boys is that they can use violence to restore their honor. But what about the messages that we give to girls and women in our culture? The social construction of femininity is in part about the messages that we teach women and girls about what it means to be feminine, what it means to be a woman, which generally also means to be heterosexual in our culture. And one very powerful message is fed to girls and women through the stories of romance and love. These messages are generally explicitly for girls and women. They're targeted to women. And the dangerous message is that a woman can save a man through her love. He's troubled, he's dangerous, he's mysterious, he has a dark past, but her love can redeem him. Only she can save him. And it's important to note that this message gets targeted to very young girls. We see here examples of images targeted to girls of 5, Beauty and the Beast, girls of 15, Twilight, and adult women of 30, 40, 50, 60, 70, as in 50 Shades of Grey. The message encourages women to stand by, a woman to stand by her man, even if he locks her in a castle, as in Beauty and the Beast, sneaks into her room at night to watch her sleeping, as in Twilight, or interferes with her ability to get her first job out of college, as in 50 Shades of Grey. These are fictional messages, but the story matters. Leslie Morgan Steiner, who writes about her experience of abuse and how she survived it in her 2010 book, Crazy Love, said the following in a 2012 TED Talk. She said, in response to her own question about her abuse experience, why didn't I leave? Why did I stay? Quote, I didn't know that he was abusing me, even though he held those loaded guns to my head, pushed me down the stairs, threatened to kill our dog, pulled the keys out of the car ignition as I was driving down the highway, poured coffee grounds on my head as I dressed for a job interview. I never once thought of myself as a battered wife. Instead, I was a very strong woman in love with a deeply troubled man. And I was the only person on earth who could help Connor face his demons. End quote. So our culture sends messages to girls and women that love can be consistent with being locked up, stalked, controlled, and that it's a woman's job to help her man face his demons, that she can save him with her love. Okay, second cultural message is part of our political and our legal history. One of the most surprising things that I learned as a student of domestic violence is that domestic violence has been illegal in the United States since about 1900. If you had asked me as a student in the 1990s when domestic violence became illegal, I would have said 1979. But laws that made it legal for husbands to use violence against their wives, which did exist in some US states, were gone by 1900. Feminist reformers targeted husbands' legal cruelty against their wives during the first wave of the feminist movement before they set their sights on suffrage. And they were successful in getting these laws repealed. But even though the laws went away, the message changed in a contradictory kind of way. It wasn't that domestic violence was wrong and should never be tolerated. Instead, our legal system sent another message, that what happens in families and in intimate relationships is private, is secret. And we have with us today a very strong cultural ideology that our intimate relationships and homes and families are our own private business. Others shouldn't intervene in what happens behind closed doors. And this ideology became inscribed in our legal history. Consider a ruling made by Judge Settle in a case from North Carolina in 1874. In this ruling, Judge Settle repealed an earlier law that made it legal for husbands to use violence against wives, but he did so in a contradictory way. Judge Settle wrote for the record, we may assume that the old doctrine that a husband had a right to whip his wife, provided he used a switch no larger than his thumb, is not law in North Carolina. Indeed, the courts have advanced from that barbarism until they've reached the position, sorry, I need my glasses for this, that the husband has no right to abuse his wife under any circumstances. But here's the interesting contradictory piece. But from the motives of public policy, in order to preserve the sanctity of the domestic circle, The courts will not listen to trivial complaints. If no permanent injury has been inflicted, nor malice, cruelty, nor dangerous violence shown by the husband, it's better to draw the curtain, shut out the public gaze, and leave the parties to forgive and forget. So the idea that we should draw the curtain and not look too closely at what happens behind closed doors has been challenged over the last 100 years, but it's still with us today. Last summer, after the media fervor about the Ray Rice abuse incident died down a little bit, the national media gave some attention to the case of District Court Judge Mark Fuller. He's a federal judge from Alabama, and he was pressured to resign, to step down from the bench after he was arrested and charged with domestic violence. The New York Times reported that Judge Fuller argued with his wife in a hotel room. She called 911, and when the officers arrived, they found cuts and lacerations on her face, and Kelly Fuller reported that her husband threw her to the ground, kicked her, and then dragged her around the room and hit her in the face. And in his statement to the press about this incident, Judge Fuller called upon the notion of family privacy. He said, "This incident has been very embarrassing to me, my family, friends, and the court. I deeply regret this incident and look forward to working to resolve those difficulties with my family where they should be resolved." That's my emphasis. He's calling on the ideology of privacy here. Like Judge Settle 140 years earlier, Judge Fuller asks us to draw the curtain and to remove our public gaze. Okay, and the last way in which our culture tolerates abuse and oppression is through our tolerance of growing economic inequality. One of the things that we've heard a lot about over the last decade is that the middle class is shrinking, the gap between the rich and poor is growing. And I think we don't think enough about the implications that this has for violence and abuse. Poverty is indeed, as Gandhi said, a deadly form of violence, and it's on the rise. 14 million more people lived in poverty in the United States in 2010 than a decade earlier. And poverty crushes the human spirit. It exposes people to all forms of violence, both on the streets and in their homes. And this has been exacerbated by the growing spatial concentration of poverty. Many people who live in neighborhoods that are decimated by unemployment, by a lack of infrastructure, high rates of violence and crime. Sociologist Jody Miller studied the experiences of young Black men and women in one of the poorest neighborhoods in St. Louis, Missouri, and she found that they were exposed to incredible levels of violence simply going around their neighborhoods. So some numbers in this graph suggest that almost half of the girls and boys that she studied had seen someone stabbed in their short lives. Over a third of them had seen someone killed. And one of the things that Miller argues happens as a result of this is that violence becomes banal. Violence becomes normal. It's simply around us. And it made the young people in her study uninterested in responding to intimate partner violence or dating violence. It seemed in some ways the way things were. They were exposed to so much violence in their neighborhoods. Poverty also increases the risk of violence in intimate relationships. So it is true, and we hear often, that domestic violence happens to everyone. It happens to college professors, lawyers, politicians, doctors. But this statement is also just a little bit misleading in that although it's true that domestic violence happens to everyone, poor women are at the greatest risk of abuse. The most recent large-scale national study of domestic violence experiences in the United States is the National Intimate Partner and Sexual Violence Survey funded by the Centers for Disease Control. They surveyed over 16,000 US adults in 2010. And as you can see from this graph, there's almost a linear relationship between income and violence. Poor women were over 3 times as likely to experience intimate partner violence victimization in the year prior to this study. So economic resources protect people from exposure to all forms of abuse. So where does this leave us? I think one of the things that we should do is not be afraid to critique the messages that we see in our entertainment. We can be entertained, but still question the message, still be critical of what images are being presented to us. My daughter is constantly, she's 12, she's constantly saying, "Mom, I think that new song is a stalker song." And I pat myself on the back for that. We can try to work against those messages that say, back up, step away, this is a private matter, and help ourselves have the courage to pull back the curtain to ask the uncomfortable question when we're concerned about a situation. And lastly, we can ask ourselves whether we want to, as a society, tolerate this growing economic inequality that creates so much suffering for so many. So thank you.
Thank you, Kristin, for your introduction and overview about this large social tradition and the way law, policy, and precedent starts to form and frame it into systems. Now we're going to hear from Susan Mark. She's the director of the Bellingham-Whatcom Commission Against Domestic Violence and has fulfilled that role since 2010. And she works with community leaders to end domestic violence in Whatcom County, working across systems of law and justice, victim services, perpetrator treatment, and other roles. She's been involved in the movement to end domestic violence for more than 15 years. And she has previously worked in roles as a sexual assault multidisciplinary response team member, providing legal and medical advocacy to victims, and facilitating support groups, professional trainings, and providing prevention education. So we thank you for doing this work in our community, as well as having worked in Seattle, Sitka, Alaska, Duluth, Minnesota, Honduras, and Flagstaff, Arizona. So she brings talent and wisdom from a lot of places to our community. So thank you for sharing more about the spectrum of abuse, that intimate partner place in that curtain, and how we can skillfully and appropriately listen when people speak to us and not harm or disturb a victim's safety. So thank you for your insights today.
Yeah, thank you for inviting me to speak today. I first wanted to make sure that people know a little bit about the Commission Against Domestic Violence. Many of you may not have heard that our community has this entity. The commission was formed in 1998. It's a joint City Bellingham-Whatcom County Commission. And so in 1998, the mayor of Bellingham and the Whatcom County executive got together and said, we need to end domestic violence in this community. And the only way we're going to do it is by guaranteeing that our community leaders are working together to address this problem. And so since then, we've had a commission. We currently have 28 members, and they're all leaders in your communities. And they come together to look at two primary things. It's ensuring best practices when the system responds to domestic violence that exists, not allowing it to be a family matter, saying that our community cares about this, and it is an affront to our community when domestic violence happens. And the other piece is educating the community, letting people like you and the rest of our community know what domestic violence is, how it impacts our community, and what are your local resources. And if you want to know more, our website is up there, dbcommission.org. You could find out more about who's on the commission, what are the specific projects we've worked on. So just some statistics. I want to bring all the things that Kristin was talking about and the video. I just want to bring it home to Whatcom County. This is a beautiful community. All the places I lived, I think this is the place that I'm going to stay, and yet we have a problem with domestic violence. Like most places, unfortunately, in our country, I don't think there are many places that can say they don't have that problem. And there are a couple things I want to note about these statistics. First of all, given all these numbers, I just want to acknowledge that in this room, I see a lot of faces, and I would imagine that some of you have been touched by domestic violence, either you personally or someone that you care about. So I just want to set the tone as we continue talking about this and as we ask questions and acknowledging that we have survivors in this room. I have no doubt of that. The other is that these numbers are likely low. One of the things we know, because of this ideology of family privacy, people don't ask for help. And so national statistics show approximately 1 in 10 victims seek help for domestic violence. So these numbers up here, people seeking law enforcement assistance, people seeking domestic violence abuse services are likely low. And yet, I'm not trying to shock you with the highness of the numbers. I think if this was 1, if any of these numbers were 1 or 5 or 10, that would be plenty. And especially you think about in these numbers, whatever they are, if they included someone that you care about, someone in your family, your sister, your daughter, your brother, someone who you work with, your neighbor, someone in your church, that means it's unacceptable. So I just want to personalize that a little bit and think, the numbers are high, and I don't think it matters. It would be unacceptable if this happened to someone that you care about. And the last statistic points to one of the things that Kristin was talking about as well, is we know that domestic violence does have a high correlation with things like poverty and homelessness. And so when a survivor of domestic violence leaves that partner, they become an increased risk for homelessness and other economic problems. And I'm going to refer to that a little bit later as well. I also want to make sure we have a common understanding of what we're talking about. I think a lot of times when we think of domestic violence, we think of the bruises, we think of the black eyes, and those certainly are there. That's part of domestic abuse. And one of the reasons I have the word abuse up here instead of violence is I really want you to think about the spectrum of abuse and thinking about it. It's a pattern. It's not something that happens once. It's not the one time. All of us can probably say, there's a time in my relationship when I behaved differently than I wish I had. It's not the one time when you were really tired or really stressed and you said something you wish you hadn't. It's a pattern. It's happening over and over again. And it's deliberate. I liked how Mary said it's not a problem with anger management. It's about managing a person. Domestic violence is deliberate. It's about maintaining control over a person. It's not someone losing their temper. That's, I think, one of the biggest misconceptions. And it includes all these behaviors. What we in the movement now, it's the newer term, is this coercive control, this idea of all of these controlling things coming together to have complete control over one person. Things like threats and intimidation. For the survivor, that can be as simple as the look that you get at the dinner table, the look that you get in the car, the look that you get when you're out in public, and that you know you're going to pay for whatever it is that you did wrong. And you probably know what it is that you did, quote unquote, wrong. Controlling every aspect of a survivor's life, making them use a credit card for every single purchase so you know exactly what they're spending money on, or tracking the mileage on their car. So when they say they went to the grocery store, did they really go to the grocery store? People actually spend time doing this. Belittling and humiliating, the name-calling, the put-downs, and the constant. Again, it's not the one time that you say something that's not that kind. It's the constant and intentional stalking, harassment, texts, ongoing text messages. Sometimes this can be apologizing or saying, I love you, please come back to me. But it's not letting it go when they say, stop, leave me alone. Strangulation, this is one of the physical ones that I put on there because it's something that is a very high risk factor. We often call it choking, and it's such an intimate way of letting someone know that their life is in your hands. You place your hands on their neck, and they know that you will decide if they breathe again or not, and that's one of the ways of controlling someone. Crazy making and manipulation, all sorts of things to make someone feel like they're the crazy one. And so if you did go ask for help, everyone's going to know that you're crazy, not the abuser, it's the survivor who's crazy. And then making use of privilege. So let's say you have a same-sex couple and the abuser is out and the survivor is not. That's a great way to manipulate that person. Or if the abuser has financial resources that the survivor doesn't, or if there's an age differential, there's all sorts of ways that taking advantage of the privilege. And that's the privilege that Jackson Katz mentions of just being a white heterosexual male and having means like just that privilege. And then when you hear all of this, you probably think, like many people do, and this is the most common question that anyone gets asked about domestic violence. So if all that is happening, why wouldn't you just leave? Or when they leave, why do they go back? I think that's a frustrating thing for people in the system. They left, why did they go back? And there's a lot of reasons up there, and there aren't enough PowerPoint slides in the world to list all the reasons why people choose to stay in relationships or choose not to leave. But there are a couple things they do want you to know is statistics show that it takes a survivor an average of 7 times of attempting to leave before they leave for good. So leaving is a process. It's not a one-time thing that happens. It's a process. And that leaving isn't always the answer. Once you leave, you might have child custody, you might have divorce, you might have shared resources, they might stalk you for the next 5 years. Leaving is not the answer. And one statistic that shows that is that women who leave their abusers are at a 75% greater chance of being killed by the abuser than those who stay. Leaving is very final, and so if someone is determined to control you, they might take that last step once they have lost control. So leaving is never the answer. And if you wanted to see more about this, after the Ray Rice NFL scandal, his wife received a lot of criticism. Not only did she stay, she married him after the incident in the elevator. And so this hashtag, these 2 hashtags surfaced of why I stayed and why I left to really bring acknowledgement to why she might have stayed or why she might have left and why other people have stayed and left. And that's a great They're very short reasons, but they're really moving, I think. And really the question is, why do we ask that question? I don't think we have a value as a society that you have to leave a relationship. I do think we have a value that you treat someone you love, you treat your partner with dignity and respect. And so I would really like to turn that question. From now on, if someone talked to you about domestic violence, I think it would be great to say, boy, why would that person treat their partner that way? And who cares why they're still in that relationship or why they went back? That's not our judgment to make. So a lot of what we've been talking about is a little heavy, and as Mary said, not common lunchtime conversation unless you work in my office. Then we talk about it most days at lunchtime and over coffee. We actually like talking about this, which is kind of odd. But the good news is that all of you can do something. In a couple minutes, I'm going to ask each of you to do something. But first, I want to note how important it is to do something. A couple years ago, one of the projects that the commission led, we did a review of intimate partner homicides in Whatcom County. We have a problem with intimate partner homicides in this county. We had several years, we had many more than is average for a community this size. And so we looked at these cases, and one of the things we found was that many people knew about the abuse, but they didn't do anything. And there's not a lot of blame there. Most people didn't know what was actually happening. They could not identify it as abuse. So there were things like a former roommate who said, I saw him beat her so hard she had to go to the hospital, but I never called 911 because I didn't want him to get in trouble. And there was a pastor who said, she told me that he held a gun to her head and threatened to kill her. And the pastor did get the gun, but didn't do anything else because he thought that was the entire problem, was the gun. Or then there was the brother-in-law who said, yeah, he asked me for a gun and I told him no, but I didn't tell anyone else that he was out looking for a gun. So it's people who weren't able to place these actions in the context of domestic abuse and then didn't know what to do, even if they could. They didn't know that you could call the police. They didn't know that they could refer that survivor to support or that perpetrator to treatment. So what I want to ask each of you to do is to not be that person who doesn't know and who doesn't do anything. I'm going to ask each of you to take a few actions after today. Hopefully we've moved you enough to feel like you want to be a part of our community solution. So you have a handout here. And this, first of all, it has our website. And on our website, we have a lot of information about domestic violence. And you could also find other
Anybody else need one?
local resources. We also have there's other national resources as well. And then on the inside, there's 6 possible actions that you could take in this community to end domestic violence. And there are things related to your workplace, to a faith community, to schools, to coaches, or just connecting with someone you know that might be a survivor or an abuser. And then there are our local resources. So I'd like to take a moment, and I'd like you to look at this, and here's what I'd like you to do. Get out your planner or your phone. This is the one time where it's socially acceptable to have your phone out, and schedule within the next month a time. I'm going to ask for a total of an hour. 20 minutes when you're going to take time and learn more about domestic violence. 20 minutes when you're going to take the first step to making one of these actions happen. You're going to go to your workplace and say, I want this policy in our workplace. You're going to go to your kid's school and say, I want my kids and a team of students to go to this youth summit we're having next fall. Take one of these actions, and then take 20 minutes and choose one of these resources on the back, one of your local resources, and say, I'm going to learn more about this agency or this perpetrator treatment provider. And so I'm going to take a moment. I'm going to let each of you decide when and what you're going to do within the next month. Okay, so I'm sure all of you aren't completely done, but I am going to say domestic violence exists in this community because we allow it to, and I think none of you want to be that person that when there's a tragedy says, I could have been the one that made a difference, that I could have been the one who could have done something differently. And it's time that either we decide to take some time out of our lives to change this, or the cycle is going to continue. We have not had enough resolve as a society to end this problem, and that's why it exists. So I'm going to ask each of you not just to leave here from lunch and say, wow, that was interesting, and I know you're each busy and have a lot of other things to do, but 1 hour for the next month, and you can really make a difference in someone's life. You can make the difference between if someone is alive or dead, and if someone lives in a life that's fulfilling because they're in a safe relationship, or if they're in a life where they're being controlled every day. So thank you.
Susan and Kristin have raised some really provocative concepts and issues that often aren't talked about openly in our community. And I want to note that there's a special class of vulnerable folks that are also possibly in your circle of possible support or action. And that is the sheet here that talks about elder abuse and a whole different cast of suffering that is existing as people age in place in homes with extended family and find themselves with increasing tensions and experiences working with loved ones who may have traumatic brain injury, aging impacts, coming home from trauma centers of the globe. There is suffering that's happening, and caregivers are suffering too. So we wanted to avail you to some of these resources because this is such a difficult conversation, and it's one that often makes its way when we've planned and reflected on it, and we've thought about those things that we care deeply about. And one of the things that Jackson Katz's work really pushes on is this concept that the role of men in this particular dynamic of violence. And so I wanted to pose a question to each of the speakers about some of the criticism that has come up and can come up, that this is actually just a bunch of feminists complaining about what it is to be biologically male. And how do we address and deal with that tension between what has been normed in some cultures as strength and moved without check and accountability has now become such egregious harm? So could you speak to that? I know Jackson Katz addresses it in his full-length film, and he also wrote a nice article after the Penn State tragedy. It's called Penn State, the Mother of All Teachable Moments. And he talks about how this power and control and domination actually coalesces and can become a normed behavior in an institution. So you could see that kind of intergenerational harm happening over 46 years somewhere. So there's some real tension here about what it is to be male, what it is to be strong, and how it is we've come to this moment. So could you speak to those pressures or criticisms?
Sure. So one of the things that I think Jackson Katz and other scholars who think a lot about the social construction of masculinity do really effectively is focus on the ways in which men are trapped and harmed by this very narrow set of characteristics that we let men express. And so there are health consequences, there are all sorts of negative consequences. And so it's really important to have men be involved in this work. And to recognize the cost that they are suffering. Most, I think, boys and men feel very strong pressure to live up to these very rigid expectations for their behavior, and I think it would be very freeing for them. So in that sense, I think he works past that critique that this is just a bunch of whiny feminists. I also think he does it quite effectively, though, because he's a big, brawny guy, and he doesn't get accused as often as perhaps some women who speak out do. Yes. Do you want to add anything?
I'll just add, I think, to bring it personal a little bit, is when I think about the movement to end violence against women and to have all sorts of equal structures between males and females. I have brothers that I grew up with. I am married to a male, and I have a male child. And when I think about what I want for these people that I care about most, is I want them to not have to live up to those values, and I would want them not to feel like they had to control their partner, because I think that's what's best. It's best for me, it's also best for them, and I think that's what Jackson Katz and a lot of people have tried to bring out, is it's not about what's best for women, it's about what's best for all of us, and there are many women and feminists in the movement who we have a lot of men that we care about as much as we care about ourselves and our women in our lives. So I think when you think about this, also think, what do I want for my child? What do I want for my brother? What do I want for my cousin, my boss? I want them also to be whole and to have lives that are fulfilling.
Thank you. We have a few questions the program committee put together because this is a tough conversation, and so we have a few ideas here, but we're also going to get to yours, and we have some question spotters who'll come around with mics in a little bit. So keep your questions. We do want to hear from you. One thing that we did want to ask was, has the conversation and treatment and intervention changed over the years? How is accountability changing as the escalation of violence is also changing in our culture around us?
Probably better for that, perhaps. So one of the things that I know about accountability for perpetrators is we have basically tried all sorts of different things over time, over 40 or 50 years. We've tried couples counseling, which hopefully most people now know is not the way to solve domestic violence. We've tried individual counseling. And what research has shown actually works is having providers of who are trained in providing perpetrator treatment, having groups of people who are perpetrators together, re-educating them, teaching them new attitudes, new behaviors, new thoughts, new ways of acting, and having this a long-term commitment, usually over a year of time in which they are meeting with other people who have the same problems and are relearning ways of acting. And we have a concern now in our state. There have been some recent research showing that perhaps that is not effective. There's a lot of debate about how that research was conducted, but I can tell you national research that has been done specifically with domestic violence abusers and specifically with domestic violence perpetrator treatment and following up to see if they continue their behaviors related to abuse, not their DUIs, not their other behaviors, but their behaviors related to abuse, that is the most effective way to change behavior. And even those researchers, the people who've been doing this for years, will say there are some people who are not going to change. They put that number around 25% of abusers aren't going to change their behavior. But that means we have a 75% that we can reach. And if we have them in the right programs, they're getting the right re-education, that changes for their current partners, their children, and any other future partner that they might have. That's where I believe a lot of our true prevention really is with those people. Yeah.
Thank you. Kristin, did you have anything to add?
I think the only thing that I might add is there's also been some really important systemic changes, such that 16% of felonies we saw in Susan's slide, arrests, are for domestic violence. We are responding to domestic violence as a crime in this community. Officers are making arrests, and that sends a message. I also hate to bring this up because sometimes it sounds like we're solving the problem, but we have some national statistics that suggest that rates of domestic violence and rates of child abuse have been going down as we've changed our systemic response. So I do think there are things that we're doing that are creating accountability and are reducing the suffering.
And Kristin, could you speak to how one might address this subordinate-dominant power dynamic if it's in an institution? We spent a fair amount of time talking about in homes and sort of behind that curtain, but we also know that this is happening at work. It's happening in our institutionalized systems. Could you speak to how someone might step up, speak up?
I think that often, this is a very, very difficult thing to do, but often the pressure can come both from within the institution and from outside of the institution, such that the work that the Commission does is an outside group who is looking at the work that's being done within our criminal justice system, within our communities, and raising questions about what are these practices and what are the effects of these practices and how do they reinforce subordination. Sometimes there can be pressure from within. Western Washington University had an interesting incident maybe a year and a half ago, some racial tension on campus, and there's been a group of students primarily, but also with some faculty support, who've really stepped up and said, we need to look at what we're doing within our community of the university to bring this conversation out into the open and to talk about racism here, racism in other places. So I think it can come from within and without. It takes so much courage, though, to step up and challenge authority within your own institutional structure. It's a very difficult thing to do.
And we do have questions from the floor. If we've got our mics, folks, ready to head around. We've got someone here in the far end by the sound unit. And further back first, and then this one. Thank you, Bill. So this is a time for members to ask questions, and if there's time after that, other guests. Often we've got a lot of members, so we'll start here and then move over to you, Jane.
Thank you. I wonder how have the courts addressed self-defense in a domestic environment where one of the partners is highly at risk for a lethal act? And in a somewhat related context, one of the things I've noticed in society, there's a huge blind spot as to the phenomenon of white privilege. And then the older consciousness is male privilege. You kind of touched on that a little bit. I wonder if you could expand. Thank you.
So the issue of self-defense is actually really problematic in domestic violence cases. Traditional self-defense law It requires a couple of things that are unlikely to happen when a victim of domestic violence defends themselves against an abuser. They require that the threat is imminent, such that somebody is confronting you right then. And it requires, for example, Washington State has a proportionality requirement such that you can't take out your gun and shoot somebody who's threatening you with their hands. And that's actually been really problematic in self-defense cases in terms of domestic violence, because in many situations a victim will know from a look in a car that generally she, but it might be he, is at risk of substantial harm. But the courts would not see that as imminent threat. It may be that in situations where people have different levels of experience with violence, different levels of familiarity with weapons, one person might feel that they need a gun or a knife to make the situation equal. And so self-defense has been problematic. There have been efforts to allow the courts, and all US states will allow information about domestic violence to be part of a self-defense case or argument. But generally, the research that I've seen suggests that it's really problematic. It's far from a guarantee of acquittal, and sometimes self-defense, victims of domestic violence aren't allowed to argue self-defense. In terms of white privilege, that's one of the things that's a little bit easier for me to talk about. It's so much easier to talk about oppression as a member of the privileged group. I don't know why we have such a blind spot in our culture to talking about this. It's really something that makes us uncomfortable. None of us like to think that we are in a position of privilege, and that can be really threatening. I think that we tend not to see the privileges. When I think about it and talk about it, I like to think about it in a personal sense. There are so many ways that my life has been privileged due to my race. And I think a lot about my grandfather, who worked on a road crew in Nebraska. And at the time that he did that job, that allowed my father to go to university. And his job was available only to people with light skin. So you see it just trickling down, and I think really thinking about it in that way helps open up that conversation. But I honestly don't have perfect answers to that question. Thank you, though, for asking it. It's an important one.
Can you speak more to how the Domestic Violence Commission or other entities are involved in thinking about how we create fundable and equitable sources and resources?
I can say one thing that I know is that all of our partner agencies who are providing direct services, whether directly to domestic violence, sexual assault services, or other agencies who are overlapping, like the Homeless Service Center, a lot of their resources are focused on victims of domestic violence, knowing that those who have the least are likely to experience the most problems, and the most problems with getting the support they need. If I had resources, I wouldn't go to a shelter. I'd go to my rich family's house instead of going to stay in a shelter. So we have to have all these different supports in our community, and we do place a lot of resources in trying to make sure that those supports are there, while at the same time we do need to work on the societal level so that our services aren't needed as much at that level.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Question over here.
Thank you. I very much appreciated everything you had to say. I've also taught in this area, and I would like to ask you about some things that you haven't talked about quite so much. What I've seen is that there is domestic violence not only by men against women, but there's violence by women against men, and it's very hard for those men who are doubly cursed to speak up, because it's embarrassing if your wife beats you or abuses you. There's also a great deal of domestic violence in gay and lesbian relationships. So it's not exclusively a male against female matter. And the other thing is, and I'd like you to comment on that, and the other thing is, what I read is that an awful lot of victims of abuse are people who grew up in families where there was a lot of that. And I don't want to say they seek it out, but they're kind of, in a strange way, comfortable with abuse being a form of how you show love. Your father or your mother showed love by spanking you and by abusing you. And that makes it, again, doubly hard for them to leave. Can you comment on those things, please?
That's a really excellent question, and I'm really glad that you raised it, because it is the case that men can be victims of abuse from heterosexual partners. Rates of domestic violence among same-sex couples are comparable to rates in heterosexual relationships. So I think we want to be careful in saying that abuse only takes on particularly gendered forms, but there are some complexities here that make the situation a little bit different. So the pattern that Susan was talking about, that she called coercive control, in which abusers are using multiple tactics to gain control in the relationship: economic control, sexual violence, physical violence. There's a new term in the literature called polyvictimization, which identifies people who are victims of multiple forms of abuse and how those forms exacerbate each other. So if you are being sexually abused and also physically abused, that changes the experience of each. You don't know if a physical abuse situation is going to turn, I'm sorry, this is very dark things to talk about over lunch, but and the research is pretty clear that there's a very large gender split, such that when men are victims of abuse, they're more likely to be victims of physical abuse only, whereas women are more likely to be victims of these multiple intersecting forms of abuse. So that's one of the patterns that changes the dynamics a little bit. But I do think you raise an excellent point about how the social construction of masculinity can prevent men from getting help and from being taken seriously when they are victims. So a police officer might say, well, you know what, you let a girl beat you up. I don't think our officers do that in their community, but certainly I think that's a problem, and we have to work really hard to break that down. One of the things that I really appreciate about our local agencies is that they've done a really excellent job in having men involved as members of the board, as volunteers. I think that men reaching out to men and saying, come to us with your stories of victimization can be really powerful. A number of years ago, one of the staff at Domestic Violence and Sexual Assault Services wrote, I think, a letter to the editor to the Bellingham Herald after the Penn State atrocity broke, and they got many, many more calls from men who were seeking services. And so I think that really just talking about that openly and trying to reach out will break that down. So that's one of the ways that gender oppression affects men and victimizes them in this situation.
Thank you.
Is that it? I think there's
James, new question.
Hi, this is for Susan. I used to work in a middle school, junior, senior high here in the county, and I have two sons that are in their early 20s. I see, and I have seen over the years working with kids, there's a real peer abuse, especially with kids of different race that are not, from Whatcom County, that have moved here. And also with my own sons, they are victims of what you showed in your PowerPoint as mental abuse, domestic mental abuse with my husband, who doesn't think he has those qualities. And I'm having a hard time convincing my one son that still lives with him that he does need to go and have some counseling. So my question is for kids that are in the schools and my sons both, what's a good age to address that? And when is it too late? Or is it ever too late age-wise to address that?
Okay, so I think a good age is preschool, but it can go anytime. I think these kids are getting these messages as soon as they turn on the TV. You can do as well as you want in your home, and as soon as they turn on the TV or leave your home, that they're going to get these messages. So I think that we need to start teaching these messages from the time they're born, from the time that they're in preschool. However, a key age has been shown to be the middle school years. That's when a lot of kids are really starting to develop these bullying tactics, and develop them into their relationships, or they're starting to be victimized by that and also carry that into their relationships. It's also an age where research shows that a lot of middle school students are in relationships. They may not look like what our relationships do, but they are serious relationships for them, and that they see a lot of physical abuse in those relationships and a lot of emotional abuse and even sexual abuse. So middle school is a great age to start doing that work and providing education in the schools. We currently have a project with the Ferndale schools. We're working in the middle and high schools to provide education and to help youth lead education for other youth. And hopefully we'll be taking that to some other schools soon. And is it ever too late? No. I think most people, I cited that statistic of about 25% don't change. I think most people can change at any time in their life. And some of it, though, they just have to come to their own realization of when they're willing to let go of that relationship with their father, with the person they care about. And it's really frustrating to want them to see, and you can't make them see, but you can keep saying, I'm here when you're ready. Or sending someone else to tell them that, I'm here when you're ready. Yeah.
We have another question.
Hi, my name is Darryl Hilaire, and it's so true everything that's being talked about here today, and I'd like to thank those people that brought us together to have this conversation. And I have one question, but invitation first. June 12th, we're going to do a play called Six Killer Buys the Redskins, and it's about this history of this abuse. You know, it's very abusive what this company is doing, and we'll bring it out. It's a comedy, but if you just pay attention to the grandmothers, you'll get the message. So you're all invited, June 12th at Lummi at Silver Reef Casino. I really agree. You know, I work at a place called the Lummi Youth Academy, and just last night we had our family meeting, which is the staff and the 20 students sit down and talk about things that are going on, and it's about abuse, you know, and recognizing the cycle of violence. And if you could kind of take us through that, I think that would be really helpful.
Thank you.
One thing I'll say too is a resource for people who are wanting to learn more, since you mentioned the Lummi Youth Academy and the agency, Lummi Victims of Crime, that provides services for victims of any form of abuse for any Native Americans specifically. They have culturally specific services. They have a conference next week. It's Tuesday, Wednesday, and Thursday, and it's free, and it's at the community house out on the reservation. And it's a great way to learn about the domestic violence and child abuse and sexual assault, and how that also ties in with the intergenerational abuse and the abuses perpetrated against Native people by white people since we stepped onto this land. And they do a great job just tying that all together for especially those of us who aren't as familiar with that. And so I would say, yes, that cycle, I think especially for people who have extra oppressions, as I liked that term that you said, the poly-victimization. So if you have been, your mom, you know, was not allowed to speak her language, and then there's alcoholism, and then there's poverty, because that's something that we do to lots of people of color, including Native Americans, and then there's all these other things happening, maybe not a lot of job opportunity, then how are you going to escape that cycle of what you've seen in your home? How are you going to pursue anything different? So I think, yeah, the cycle of abuse and a lot of what those students at the Lummi Youth Academy have experienced so many other forms of victimization and oppression, that cycle, it just becomes even more, it continues even further. And it's harder to get out of because you have so much more to climb over to get out.
Could you also speak to the cycle of abuse of the pressure to build up, to blow up the honeymoon? Could you speak about that smaller cycle, please?
Yes, so common in a relationship is, this is another reason people don't leave. It's not all bad. So if your partner's really nice to you at the beginning, because you wouldn't go out with them again if they hit you on the first date, right? So your partner's really nice to you in the beginning, and then you're somehow hooked in. And then there's this kind of tension building phase. So that's when, especially over time, you know that something's coming. And so you know that you better be very careful, because if you take one step wrong, something's going to happen. And a lot of victims will say they will do something wrong in the tension building phase just to get to the next phase, which is the violence phase, because the tension is so scary, because you know something's coming and you don't know what it is and you don't know how serious it is. So after the tension building phase, then is what they call the violent phase, where that can be the extreme physical or the emotional or the sexual or all three, whatever that combination looks like. And then usually after that, there will be back to this calm honeymoon phase. So the apologies, I love you, please come back. Maybe some threats in there too. If you leave, then I'm going to get the kids. No one's ever going to believe you. But it's kind of like recreating that relationship, keeping them hooked in. And then once that relationship's pretty solid again, then the tension will come in again. And these cycles, they can be months, they can be days, they can be hours. It just kind of just keeps going and cycling until one of them decides to end it for whatever reason or however they can.
Okay. So we are at our 1:30 time spot here today. So we have time for one last quick question, and then we're going to have to wrap up today.
Thank you. Thank you very much for bringing this forward. Abuse is probably, in my opinion, one of the most tough things that we have to address in our entire nation right now. My name is Joy Gilfill, and I'm president of the Restorative Community Coalition. I've been studying on this for 5 years in Whatcom County, and it's not a pleasant subject. And looking at systemic abuse, legislative abuse, leadership abuse, on every single level, we're dealing with it, and it's really been in the news lately. And so I'm encouraging you to continue to work with this stuff. Shame is one of the biggest things we've learned. Shame as a leader, shame as a person that's done it, shame as us as users. So I just want to say thank you very, very much. We are going to be bringing a lot of programs forward. It's taken us a long time.
Do you have a
it's
question
coming.
or just a thank you?
That's it. I just want to acknowledge that this is the toughest thing that we have to deal with. Thank you.
Well, I want to thank you for coming today. I know that, as I said when we started, this is not a conversation people usually have over lunch, much less with strangers and people they don't know well. So I want to thank you for being brave to be here today, and I want to thank you because it models for all the people who watch the video in years to come to say there's someplace we can get started on this little cycle. It lives in each of us as we tense, build up, and decide how much power, control, and insistence we need to get our way in life, and how do we come back from that build-up. So if we can build that healthier pattern as a community, we're heading somewhere. And I thank you for getting us started by having this conversation. So thank you, and thank you to our guests.